I'm just interested in this kind of idea that, yes, there's action and there's inaction, and sometimes in relation to intention, we have one in mind.
You're listening to Good is in the Details. I'm Gwendolyn Dolske.
And I'm Rudy Salo.
And this is the podcast where we learn what we didn't know in the spirit of Socrates, all with the aim of a more knowledgeable life, a happy life. In today's episode, we are talking about ethics, and our guest's book weaves together ideas about law and culture and history to this question of what constitutes a right action versus a wrong action. And we have professor and author of From Acton to Ethics, Constantine Sandis. Sometimes people think about ethics as just like finger wagging and stuff like that. It is intriguing. So, if somebody says to you, well, it's the thought that counts. Like, let's say you get a gift and it's not all that great, and somebody says, it's the thought that counts. That position is that the weight or the moral worth of the action is in the idea preceding the action. And then if somebody is looking at the consequences of the action, that's a utilitarian point of view. So a lot of dialogue about the logistics of where is the moral worth of an action has to do with what comes before and what comes after. So lots of debates about that. What Constantine did in his book is he threads together things like virtue ethics and all sorts of contemporary issues that make us think more about responsibility and the actor when it comes to ethics. That's what we have in store for you today.
It's a lot. It's an ethical sandwich. You got the before, you got the after. As an attorney, obviously, we are governed by the canons of ethics, and we always have to be ethical. And ethics is pervasive throughout our practice, always putting the clients first and being made aware of our duties there. So I suppose if you are a philosophy major and you are hell bent on going to law school, then I recommend that you study ethics. I think that would serve you very well. And I think this episode does a good job of laying a good foundation.
Yeah, because it is the foundation. Like when we were talking about writing contracts where you're putting the intention out there and the agreement of terms, actually law and the concept of justice is underscored by these ideas of right and wrong. It's what amounts to something that's so egregious that it becomes a crime. For instance, like what kind of harm, to what degree, intentionality, motivation, all that stuff. So I loved Constantine's work. I'm glad that we're kicking off 2025 like this. And just speaking of kicking off 2025, please check out Rudy's Substack. You wrote a really lovely piece about the LA fires. You can check out our Patreon for information on how you can help. Everybody's on our mind. Los Angeles is on our mind. Also want to add, we've reconnected with Magic Mind, that wonderful supplement that keeps you going. And they have a new product out that is great for sleep. It's all natural. Check out our show notes so that you can get your dose of Magic Mind. It will keep you going throughout the day. And yes, you can take it with coffee. It doesn't give you the jitters. It is just pure awesomeness. Okay, let's talk about From Acton to Ethics with Constantine Sandis. Constantine, let's go into this. We are going to be talking about ethics today. Thank you so much for coming on Good is in the Details. I do want to ask you something that's not exactly about your book, but there is this movement to cut the humanities right now, like, budget cuts, and maybe it's not that important. So I would like to know a bit about your story. What made you fall in love with philosophy? And then the subject of ethics in particular. I know for me, my first philosophy class, when I read The Apology, that was it for me. I was like, I need to study everything. I don't want to do anything else other than major in philosophy. And people will ask me, why did you pick philosophy? And I always say it chose me. In the same way I like chocolate. I didn't make a decision to like it, but I just, read it and thought I have to do more. So what is your story of what made you gravitate to philosophy?
Thank you. And it's really great to be on Good is in the Details. I love your podcast.
Yay.
So did you read The Apology in school, you mean? You were reading it in school already?
My first year of university.
Oh, first year of uni. Wow. I was quite late to ethics, actually, not to philosophy. I guess I read a lot of novels as a teenager, and some had philosophical themes, but also kind of music, I suppose. I listened to music that, it will sound awful now because it's not not particularly philosophical. But when you're a teenager, I would listen to, like, I don't know, heavy metal music, and it would have all these like metaphysical themes and religious themes and whatever. It sort of got me thinking about those kind of things. And then sort of novels, even not particularly, avant-garde novels or anything, even just like Terry Pratchett novels or something as a kid. And I was always kind of philosophical themes. I wanted to study something called PPP, which is quite rare, which is philosophy, psychology, and physiology. So I was quite into psychology as well. So it kind of brought things about mind and behavior and philosophy together. And I couldn't do it because you needed maths for the statistics. I ended up studying philosophy and theology for my first degree. And that was I was still interested in that sort of religious stuff back then. And I guess by the time I went to university, I mean, this is just so cliche and traditional, but I mean, it would have been Nietzsche would have been the first philosopher I read.
The dark horse. There we go.
It was definitely like it would have been, Nietzsche not at a very young age, but certainly one of the first philosophy books, if not the first pure philosophy book I read. As an undergraduate, I studied mainly, I guess, what people call continental philosophy. So I studied post-Kantian philosophy, Nietzsche, Sartre, Fichte, this kind of stuff. I did aesthetics, and then I did philosophy of mind. And my tutor was a Wittgenstein scholar. I never went to study Wittgenstein, didn't even know who he was, but I ended up falling in love with Wittgenstein through that. That was my sort of first, after Nietzsche, I suppose, the first philosopher I really got into. So as you can see, there's not much, apart from like genealogy of morals, there's not much ethics going on. I was a bit suspicious. I did Christian ethics, which I hated. I was actually, the same term, was doing Nietzsche and Christian ethics in my theology component. I was really into, and we'll talk about what this means, but I guess what's called philosophy of action. So I was into what I was saying about PPP. I was interested in the relation between, I guess, mind and behavior and free will and those kind of agency, those kind of questions. During my graduate studies, there were a lot of people working on reasons for action. And I thought, oh, this is, what are reasons? And this sounded like philosophical psychology and kind of, motivation and reasons and so on. But it transpired that this was a big thing in moral philosophy. Mm-hmm. Why should we do this rather than that? What is a good reason for acting? What are the reasons for choosing a certain lifestyle or whatever? So I kind of got into ethics through the back door, through this kind of reasons stuff. And then it quickly transpired I needed to really catch up. I hadn't done ethics as an undergraduate. I had to really catch up. And then I started reading all the moral philosophy that I'd failed to read as an undergraduate and was very into it, and kind of normativity and what are practical reasons and this kind of stuff. But of course, all the moral theories and applied ethics and so on. So that's how I came to ethics. And in a way, it kind of shows in this book, because I'm sort of like, people in ethics need to think about action more.
Yeah, that's something I was thinking about as I was reading, because I'm somebody who is completely in love with the mystery genre when it comes to reading. And I just read a book that was a true crime. That's in the back of my mind as I'm then encountering your work. And I'm thinking, of course, the reason why, let's say something like true crime or even just the mystery genre for fun is because we're not only interested in the deed itself, we're not trying to figure out who did it and how. We're also trying to figure out why. Like, that's part of what is so intriguing about this. And so your work is really interesting to me, because I was thinking in terms of ethics, where we're just discerning the distinction between right and wrong. Is it consequence or is it the reason? You've got this approach where I had to think about like the tracing of actions, or what is non-action and who is responsible. It seems like there's a free will and determinism element to it. There's a legal part to it. You've threaded together so many things that have to do with ethical action that I think are absolutely fascinating. Like, two different people can do the exact same action, but it's not the same because they're doing them for different reasons or context, how much that matters. Well, actually, let me back up. I'm sorry. I'm just like ranting now. I'm just loving all of the connections that I'm finding in your book. What does it mean when we're talking about recur and the trace of an action?
Oh, yes. I'll tell you about recur, but just before, so true crime, is very important in this connection, because the motive is, of course, a big thing that we get in detective novels, for example, and the idea that until you find, you can have your suspicions, but really it's the motive, who had a motive, and then that's going to help the detective eliminate things and so on. And then there are these distinctions between motive and intention. The first book I read about action was a book by someone called Alan White called Grounds of Liability, and it was a philosophy of criminal law book. It wasn't a kind of philosophy of mind or ethics book, and it was about, in criminal law, the distinction between when is an act voluntary, non-voluntary, involuntary, intentional, unintentional, motive. So it was that world that also drew me in. And that's maybe a little bit different from Ricoeur, but I came to Ricoeur sort of reasonably late in my academic life. What I liked about Ricoeur was he was a continental philosopher, but he was engaging with philosophers like Elizabeth Hanscom and Donald Davidson. So he sort of had one foot in that analytic camp, especially when he moved to Chicago. But he was also bringing in something that I think was missing in analytic philosophy, a kind of life. He was bringing all this Freud in, so the psychology was coming back, and it wasn't this kind of detached, sort of quite abstract thing that you sometimes find in continental philosophy. And of course, with the trace, he brings in the sort of origins of trace theory in Levinas are ultimately tied to trace theory in relation to the Holocaust, for example, in terms of, the Nazis were trying to eliminate all traces of what they had done. And what is it to try and eliminate a trace? And can you leave other traces in the process of this? And so it's got this kind of very real, earthy kind of background. It's not particularly abstract. And it's sort of tied to philosophy of history. What is history? What are the traces of history that we find? Kind of like ruins in Heidegger or whatever. So it's got that kind of background. And then you might think, well, what on earth has this to do with action and ethics and the kind of things moral theory and free will and so on? What Ricoeur does is he thinks of action as the leaving of a trace, I suppose. That's one way to kind of understand what's going on. And he makes these parallels between, I guess, language and action. So if you think about the act of writing, which was really big, Derrida and all this stuff in France. So you think about there's the act of writing, and then there's the thing written, which are the marks left on the page. So Ricoeur gets kind of quite poetic about this and sort of says that obviously not all action is writing, but all action is like writing in that we act and then we leave these marks in the world, sometimes literal footsteps or whatever on the beach, and sometimes in a more figurative sense. But there was this idea that there's the thing written and the act of writing it, the thing said and the act of saying it, likewise the thing done and the act of doing it. And I don't agree with Ricoeur on some of the details, but I think these general parallels seem kind of a nice way into thinking about at least two concepts of action, where one is this, what did I do? Think of your crime, oh my God, what have I done? And then there's the act of doing it, which is, I think, more closely tied to things like motive and intention.
So what do you think philosophy offers that psychology doesn't, since you've been in both of these realms and we're talking about like motive and intention behind action?
That's a good question, and very hard to answer, because it really depends on, which psychologist and which philosopher we're talking about. It's not as easy as, hey, philosophy, all philosophers do this really cool thing that psychologists don't do, or vice versa. In Nietzsche's time, these two things are not that divorced yet, philosophy and psychology. So they're sort of growing together, and then there's this big separation. I suppose psychology is increasingly very empirical, and there's nothing wrong with that. Some philosophy is very empirical, which is why I said it depends which philosophers you ask, but some is quite conceptual. And so I think it's interesting to take these important empirical experiments, whether they're in social psychology or motivational psychology or cognitive psychology, and kind of ask conceptual questions about them, because sometimes, not always, sometimes philosophers are better at kind of making finer conceptual distinctions than an empirical psychologist might be, where they might do all these experiments and then they infer certain things from them, but they might not be as nuanced as a philosopher might be about, well, hang on, what is an action? What is an intention? And so on. They're not really prone to sitting down and thinking at length about what's the difference between motive and intention. That's something, I'm not saying psychologists aren't interested in this question, but their approach might be quite different. And I think both are very valuable, and I particularly like it when they come together.
So what is the difference between motive and intention?
So think of it in terms of example. Intentions tend to be far more particular and closer to things like purposes or aims. But if you think of motives, traditionally motives look a lot like character traits. So you might have greed, jealousy. These tend to be like classic motives. And sometimes they can be more refined. The motive was this particular inheritance or money or whatever in a crime novel. Whereas the intention, obviously, there's got to be some relation between the motive and the intention for any given act. They can't be so completely unrelated that there's a disconnect. But if my motive for over-ordering or whatever is greed, what's the intention? The intention might be I was intending to have, I don't know, a fun meal but it might not be. It might be that my intention, I'm having a really bad day and I'm trying to not think about whatever, work, family, whatever. And so my intention is to distract myself from that. But the motive might still be greed if I'm over-ordering or something. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It reminds me of this classic question that everybody seems to have encountered when it comes to ethics of it's wrong to steal, but what if you are starving and then you need to feed your family? And then in your book, there's also the flip side of that. So the question is always on, the person who is doing the stealing and the motive and the intention, because then the motive changes the gravity of the action. But in your book, there's also that question of, but is it wrong for somebody who has a lot to deprive somebody of food who can't get it? And then that would go toward greed, like to hoard all of this stuff to put somebody in a state where they need to go and steal.
That's right. If you think about it, so suppose take something where people have strong moral views about, whether it's you shouldn't kill or you shouldn't steal or whatever. Now, there may be cases where we all think you should never do that. It's always wrong. Or you may be more particularist about it and think don't kill unless it's in self-defense. Don't steal unless, there may be all sorts of theories from unless you needed to survive to, unless you're stealing from someone who's gotten their money through some, don't steal unless it's from billionaires or whatever. So you could have kind of a very rigid morality or a more particularist morality. But even on the rigid one, suppose I were to think it's always wrong to kill, just to keep a kind of classic easy example that's not particularly controversial. And then there's different acts of killing where the motive and the reason and so on comes in. And there's also the sort of mind of the person or indeed creature doing the killing. It's very, when a lion kills a wildebeest or whatever, it's a very different act from someone shooting another human or something like that. But also, when in criminal law, it's standard that if someone is not of sound mind, then that act of killing is very different from one that was predetermined, cool, calm, and collected, and all those kind of things. So in the doing of it is where, on the one hand, there's space for mitigation. If it turned out someone was mentally unwell, or maybe they didn't realize they were even killing, a mistake. It may be manslaughter rather than murder. They may still be culpable or responsible in some way, but there's kind of grounds for mitigation, but also for the opposite, because the intention and motive might reveal something that's particularly kind of abhorrent to us morally, the sort of cruelty with which someone knowingly went to kill for revenge, or revenge is another classic motive, of course. So whereas when you just think of, if you just read the line, someone was shot or murdered or whatever, all of that is kind of absent. All the juicy stuff is kind of absent. And you just get the thing that you might think is right, is wrong or unjustifiable. But all the other stuff is kind of absent, which is, I think, why we like, or some people like, crime literature and films and so on, because you get all that other stuff about, well, how did we get to this point.
Yes, I think that's what it is that we want the understanding that it's not just the act itself, but in order for us to maybe heal or be whole, or we have to somehow get, even if we don't agree with it, we still have to get the causal factors that led to whatever action or inaction. That's another big part of your book, is examining non-action as also a sort of action that has its own motives and intentions. Like you even, I have to give you props for this, you even quote Carrie Fisher's memoir, which I absolutely loved. I'm reading an academic book and I see that in there. And the reason I love it is because so many, I mean, it's okay. Like so many academics, they don't pull from relatable stuff sometimes. And so when you put that in there about the experience of recovering from drug addiction, that the whole paradigm of that is an abstinence. It's a non-action. What is non-action in this realm of ethics?
I love Carrie Fisher's book, and she's incredibly she's incredibly smart. I mean, even when she's talking about that stuff, when she's talking about what I'm doing is not taking drugs. That's very different from, I've got a cat next to me, he's not taking drugs right now or ever. But he's not taking drugs, right? He's not making an effort to not take drugs. His whole he's not in a rehab clinic where the sole kind of aim and intention is to do not taking drugs, which is, can be quite hard for people and can become also a performative in front of other people and so on, right? So it's not even an omission, it's just a non-action. My cat's just not doing drugs. Like, it's not a thing the cat is doing. So I got very interested in this distinction between kind of doing and non-doing, partly from the Bhagavad Gita. So there's this sort of stuff in kind of Hindu philosophy in the Gita where really that distinction is challenged. So there's this thing about, should this guy go and kill these people? I mean, the kind of intentions behind it are a little bit complicated, but should he go and kill these people? The question is then put not just what would this killing be, but what is not killing them and the different descriptions of not doing something. So suppose there's someone you don't like. I'm not saying you would ever act this way, but there's someone, let's talk about someone I don't like. And I know they're trying to speak to me and I'm ignoring them. That's very different from not hearing them, where, someone's trying to get your attention and you're oblivious to it. In a way, that not turning and giving them attention, maybe kind of actively ignoring them, that's a kind of action, even though it looks like an omission. It also is an omission. I'm omitting to speak to them, or I'm refraining from speaking to them. What I found interesting in the Gita is this thought that any action has many descriptions, and that's something we get in analytic philosophy from kind of Elizabeth Hanscom onwards. But an act has many descriptions, but it looks like it can have positive and negative ones. So then it looks like in anything I'm doing, I might in doing that not be doing something else, and vice versa. How seriously we take that ethically is kind of very controversial. So famously, a lot of utilitarian or other consequentialist philosophers thought in not donating to charity, you're letting people die, and that's as bad as killing them. So that stuff, if you take it very seriously, can appear, oh my God, I'm murdering people every second or something like that, or at least letting them die. So I'm just interested in this kind of idea that yes, there's action and there's inaction, and sometimes in relation to intention, we have one in mind, right? I'm not intending to kill anyone when I'm not giving to a particular charity for whatever reason. But that doesn't mean that I'm not maybe allowing something to happen, even obliviously maybe.
Rudy, I'm curious, since you're in law, since you do law stuff, lawyerly things, when you're putting together a contract, that would outline the intention of the parties. And for somebody to violate that contract, what would have to be true for it to not be considered wrong? Where there's circumstances or something like that. Like, is that there's never part of the, like, it's unforeseeable or something like that? Like, in what case you've outlined all the intentions, but then to go ahead and violate that? Like, that's what I'm thinking about too, where it would be, it's not just the violation of the contract, but there has to be some other reasoning or grounds or understanding in order for it to be okay.
Well, I mean, the contract should contain the four corners of all the agreements and intentions of the parties. There's a concept of the parole evidence rule, meaning if there's something outside of the contract that will shed some light on an ambiguity in the contract, you could bring that in. But there's usually you have provisions in the contract at the end of a contract. Most people call the boilerplate or miscellaneous section that basically says, hey, this contract contains all of the agreements between the parties, and anything extraneous to this contract will not be considered. Some of the examples where things could be considered is if there's a mistake of law. That's pretty rare. The person that's invoking that argument would need to try to prove that there is a mistake of law and why they should go outside of the four corners of the contract. But in general, the contract is supposed to lay things out as the parties did intend. I actually teach how to do contract drafting down at Chapman School of Law, Fowler School of Law. And one of the things that we focus on in teaching how to people how to draft is getting rid of as many ambiguities as possible in order to not, make that contract. It could be interpreted one way or the other way. So yeah, I mean,
because it's all intention, right? Like that's what I'm thinking about is like where you're actually putting it on paper, what everyone's intention is. And that's so important in order to move forward with any action.
Couldn't agree more with you, Gwen. And that's why I teach contract drafting. And that's why I tell people the old phrase that one of my bosses told me, there's nothing more expensive than a cheap lawyer. A cheap lawyer will lead to more problems in your life than a really expensive lawyer, because a cheap lawyer doesn't know all of the laws and doesn't know what provisions need to be in there. Doesn't even know how to ask the questions of their client or the client's counterparty in order to make that contract contain everything that it needs to contain. Yeah, I mean, your question's a good one, but the whole purpose of drafting a contract is to make sure that the intent is within the four corners of that agreement.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was thinking about with Constantine, with your book. I kept thinking about legal issues, and I'm wondering, isn't action evidence of a motive? Or like, where does that get complicated?
Gosh, that is a good question. Yeah.
Like if you want to hold somebody responsible, I'm like, isn't the action the evidence of, because the action is the after effect of the motive or the intention. So we know that a motive and intention has to be there, but wouldn't the action be the evidence itself?
I think that's right. That for the most part. So obviously, we can debate whether reflex actions are actions or not, and this kind of things where maybe there's no motive or intention behind.
Like blinking is an action, but it's not.
So we can have these cases, but the kind of things that would be contract bound, for example, are not. I mean, I guess you can have contracts for anything, but they're unlikely to be those kind of things. So you're right. And then there's two schools of thought. So there's there's always more than two, but kind of crudely, there's the causal school of thought where intention causes action. That's kind of one kind of standard picture where you have, and maybe intention is something in the mind and action is something in the body, and you have the old kind of Descartes problem, how does mind cause body or whatever. So that there's that kind of view of you've got the stuff in the mind, whether it's intention, belief, desire, and you've got this behavior that's kind of physical or physiological, and somehow the one causes the other. And maybe the effect is evidence of the cause, is kind of part of what you were saying, I think. There's another model which also fits into the evidence thing you were saying, so that it's compatible with both, where it's not so much cause and effect, but something like the inner and outer side of one thing. And that's something we find. I know from one of your other podcasts, you're not incredibly fond of Hegel, I think, but that's something you find, for example. So I'm sorry, I apologize.
What gave it away?
I'm sorry to bring it up.
No, it's only because he's difficult to read, but it has nothing to do with the theory itself.
But that's something we find in Hegel, where behavior has an action, action has an inner and outer side, and the outer side is bodily movement and the inner side is intention. But it's like the one is an expression of the other rather than an effect. I don't know if that makes sense. And you get that in kind of other philosophers too, but he's like an early-ish, I think you get it in Wittgenstein, for example, as well. But in both cases, so you might think we infer the motive from the behavior. In some cases, you're not even inferring. It's just obvious. You don't see mere behavior and then infer. If someone is screaming in pain, you don't just merely see bodily movements and then infer from the sounds this person must be in pain. You immediately react to someone in pain, I think. And so I think sometimes if people are really good at hiding intention and motive, then you need the detective to come in and do all this inferencing and inferring and all this stuff. But in kind of ordinary life, it's like the intention is visible in the action. It's not kind of hidden behind it. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. I also like this discussion about beliefs as how they contribute. So let's just say somebody were to do an awful crime that was, let's say, a race-based type of crime, a type of hate crime. You have that, and then you go back and you see that their underscoring beliefs are terribly problematic that led to the expression of that. So where do we go as ethical or as moral theorists with that? Where do we tackle the issue? Because it seems like if you eradicate or work on that belief, then you diminish that type of a crime. But then we understand, it's like, oh, okay, I understand why you did this kind of, I don't agree with it. I have an understanding of it, but now I know the source of the problem is in that belief that is leading to that action.
That's a really good point. So hate crime is, I would say, even like the perfect example of how these things come together. On the one hand, it's tempting to think I've got the crime, the thing done, and then I've got the motive, racial hatred or whatever the particular bigotry might be behind the hate crime. It's tempting to think, okay, well, there's one thing which is injuring this person or bullying this person or killing this person, and then there's the motive. But the concept of hate crime, what it does is it says, no, there's a thing done that is itself a hate crime. I began by saying, oh, look, you've got the thing done and the doing of it, and the doing it is where all the psychology is. And I think sometimes, while I think that picture is generally true, sometimes we can redescribe the thing done to say, actually, we're interested in a kind of subset of these things where the motive is part of the definition of the crime in a way, so that a hate crime is not just, it's something done with a particular motive, and then that becomes a thing one does, like a hate crime does. I think it's a really nice example of how stuff about psychology can affect a description of not just an act, but a crime. It's a bit like, think of the difference between any falsehood and lying, where I might say something false because I'm ignorant or mistaken or deluded in some way, or I may say something false with the intention to deceive. So lying is a kind of act, but the intention to deceive is built into how we characterize the act. And so then there's a kind of action that isn't separate from intention. So intention doesn't seem to be the cause of lying, it's part of what it is to lie.
I was thinking about this question. I think I saw somebody on Blue Sky put out something about is there a difference between lying and spreading misinformation? And the philosopher in me was kind of hooked on trying to make that distinction because I believe there is one. And I think it goes down to intentionality, that there's the possibility with spreading misinformation that is not with the intention. It can be, but it's not necessary for it to be misinformation, that there's an intention, whereas opposed to lying requires that intention. It's a necessary condition.
That sounds absolutely right to me. So in the case where you're knowingly spreading misinformation with the intention to deceive, it is a form of lying, and a particularly horrendous one because it's on a mass scale. Mm-hmm. But many people spread misinformation in complete ignorance just by hitting the repost button or whatever. And maybe they don't think at all in a kind of Hannah Arendt sense, there's no thought there. Or maybe they just think this is right. They've just got misguided beliefs about something and they really think they're spreading the truth. I would imagine, the majority, I'm not going to give, I'm not going to pretend I have statistics here, but I'd imagine the majority of cases, spreading misinformation is not lying. It's people thoughtlessly or in some other way misguidedly just spreading the stuff that they've seen or read, which they assume is true, or they don't even think about it. But of course it is possible. And some people very knowingly spread misinformation for whatever reason. And then that does seem like a form of lying.
Yeah, a clear ethical violation. But then with the misinformation spreading where there is no intention to deceive, you just are doing it. But then that lack of checking your sources and doing that, and if it causes harm, then then it's like the lack of thought is the unethical part. So it's still unethical. Like, I guess there would be degrees of it.
Yeah, no, that
What do you think? Like, I've been stuck on that distinction. I'm like, oh yeah, all intentional spreading of misinformation is lying, but not all lying is spreading misinformation. No, wait. I messed it up. Wait,
All
I
right.
got it backwards.
Backtrack.
You know what, Constantine? I haven't had my magic mind
You need a
this morning.
shot of magic mind.
Speaking of intentional doings for 2025 and getting my mental health all in order, I don't have to just have coffee. I can have magic mind. Link in the show notes. Okay, Constantine, go back to it. The distinction between lying and misinformation
is people who haven't had magic mind, and then they're just kind of spreading. But so
exactly,
it looks like you can I think you can do either without doing the other. When you lie, you misinform, but whether you're spreading misinformation, you might be lying to one very particular person about one very particular thing. So there's misinforming, intentional misinforming, but whether that counts as spreading, that's a whole other kind of question. Is one lie a spread already, or is that kind of not enough? So the spreading of misinformation seems like a wider thing, and I think it can be a kind of particularly dangerous form of lying where you're lying to masses on social media or television or whatever. But like you were saying, it can also be mindless, and that doesn't mean that there's no culpability there, but it's not the culpability of a liar. It's someone who should have known better or could have known better, didn't check their sources, didn't. So there's a kind of something's gone wrong there. There's a vice there, at least in many cases, but it's not lying. It's not bothering to check either because you're arrogant and think you know, or because you're thoughtless, or, it could be.
Or even confirmation bias. You're just so ready to be right about something that
maybe I wouldn't want to speak for you, but I've certainly reposted stuff without checking it because I think it's true. And I think, there are things where you think, oh, I'd better check this. But there's other things where you just think, oh, this seems obvious to me. So we're all kind of guilty of it to some extent, or at least most of us. And people can spread misinformation, very innocently. A lot of people who spread misinformation are victims. You've been tricked by propaganda. You've been deceived by people who've in some way outsmarted you, and you spread the misinformation. When we think of spreading misinformation now, we typically think of it in quite political terms. There's been a lot of, think of the history of medicine and what people used to think was good or bad for you, or the history of nutrition or whatever. Lots of people have spread misinformation thinking they were telling the truth, even people who'd done some research. And then there's the question of to what degree are we culpable? And your favorite philosopher, Hegel, has the right answer to this question, because what Hegel does, which is really quite impressive, I think, is he doesn't say, am I or you responsible for this action or not? He says responsible in what sense and to what degree. So he doesn't think there's a question. A lot of philosophers before and after Hegel think of responsibility as, did I do it or not? Am I responsible or not? Whereas Hegel wants to say, well, responsible for what? For doing it intentionally, for doing it by mistake, for doing it on purpose. So he has all these kind of different things. And he says, there are different ways in which one, and different degrees to which one can be responsible for something. And some may be worse than others. But he does even talk about if there's cases where I didn't know better, but could have and should have, I'm still responsible for acting in an uninformed way. That's my little advert for Hegel.
I would like to wrap up with this question. This is something that has been on my mind a lot when it comes to ethics and responsibility and even legal questions. Where do you see the future of this, given that we're learning more about neuroscience and some physical, genetic, some other causal factors are being introduced on a biological level to explain behavior? So where does that line of responsibility and ethical action come?
Great.
Where are we moving in ethics? Let's just say, we learn about serial killers and there's actually a genetic component to that where like the place for empathy, the placeholder in the brain for that is just non-existent. Does that mean, where do we move from there when we find out that there is that genetic component, or if we do?
That's a great, great question. And I think we're sort of on a path that's been going on for kind of centuries. If you go back to like Greek tragedy, it looks like they really don't care much about things like intention and motive. If Oedipus killed his dad and slept with his mum, he's a polluted being. It doesn't matter that he was oblivious to this, that he's done the sin, the crime, and it doesn't really matter to that society whether he was mistaken or couldn't have known or whatever. I'm sort of thinking of just like non-Freudian readings, just like reading Sophocles. We're already in a place where we're thinking of not just motive and intention, but kind of mitigating factors and aggravating factors. Is it a crime of passion? So we're way down this kind of line. But the future, as you rightly say, has a lot more kind of neuroscience in it and a lot more stuff about, well, are there people with like neurological disorders and what do we do? So we've moved from the kind of grand black and white theories to things that are a lot messier. And they're messier ethically, but I would say really what this takes us to is what the future of so-called punishment will look like. That's really where this stuff might really differ in terms of like so-called correctional facilities, all the different sort of what you do with someone who's a danger to other people, but maybe through no fault of their own or some fault of their own, but not that of someone with a clear murderous intention and whatever. So where we move away from these old ideas of punishment as revenge or whatever, or even just as laying down the law on someone or an act of aggressive power, and you know with all the biases that these kind of systems contain, to kind of looking at the background of the person who committed the crime and their situation and all. I mean, it has obvious ethical implications, but it's ultimately I think the real changes. On an optimistic day, I'd say we might lead to a more just kind of penal system, but there's also all sorts of reasons not to be particularly optimistic, right? Because like there's what's going on with the science, but then there's what's going on in kind of societies across the world, and especially in the United States today. So the science might make you optimistic, but then what you see around you might make you less.
I was just thinking about, how important these kinds of conversations are, because we crave order. We crave something that's objective. Like, you did this, therefore you get X punishment. But it doesn't work with the messiness of the human being and context. And so we've got these two things, one that's a chaos and disorder and all sorts of variables, and then we want the order and we're trying to fit them together. And it's important to have these conversations so that we can get to justice, like you said, where we're understanding action. But it's important even like in our everyday lives. It doesn't have to be as grand as a judicial system or a trial. It can be even with parenting. Like, your child is acting in a particular way, and instead of trying to punish them, try to understand the origin of what is going on in the context and why are they behaving that way in order to facilitate better behavior in relationships, or even in our own friendships. Like, if somebody backs away and we're not understanding what's going on, or if we want to be a good friend and be a good listener, we just have to understand there's no prescriptive. Like, you have to understand the context of the relationship, circumstances, how people communicate in order for it to work. So I really enjoyed this conversation and this kind of diving into, well, what makes us tick and understand so that it can make us better citizens, like better friends, better parents, and then more understanding when it comes to the legal system and the crime and punishment system.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, we really do become more understanding when we think of these things. And I think overall, it's a good thing if society moves from, oh, well, if that's the crime, that's the punishment. You did this, you get that. No matter what, no ifs, no buts, no, that kind of very kind of crude black, and of course, you could have AI running a judicial system like that. It would be just like, right, that's the crime, that's the punishment. But like you said, in starting from everyday life, trying to get to the roots of what happened. And, there's people who complain, but then, it's too lenient, everyone ends up innocent or whatever. And it's not about that. It's about trying to kind of understand and improve and figure out what exactly has happened. What has this person actually done? What do they think they've done? Why were they doing it? And yeah, it starts starts, with one's friends and family and so on, and then it grows to, employment law and these kind of things, to the bigger stuff. And of course, nobody likes it if people, when they go to ethics, I get why. It's very attractive to have a big, clear theory, deontology, 10 commandments, utilitarianism, maximize pleasure or whatever, maximize utility. It's nice because they're clear, they're easy, they seem actionable in some sense. Life seems messier than that.
Yeah. Constantine, thank you for coming on Good as in the Details to talk about the messiness of the human condition. And we can learn the details.
The details.
Good as in the Details is produced by Dr. Gwendolyn Dolske and Rudy Salo. Join us in our mental wealth for 2025 by getting your magic mind, link in the show notes, and you can get the bundle for the daytime focus and for the sleep well. This is a perfect way to launch all of your goals for 2025. Magic Mind. Remember to also check us out on Patreon, patreon.com/goodisinthedetails. It's a way that you can join the community, our book club, and support the pod so we can keep bringing you great content. Check out our Instagram, Good as in the Details Pod. We're also on Facebook, and I will also link our Blue Sky. We'd love to see you over there. Okay, until next time, bye.